patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 74 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me this week. I hope you are enjoying your Martin Luther King Jr. long weekend. Make sure to subscribe to our email list for the latest notifications and updates about our program, and consider becoming a Patreon member to get even more benefits for all of you to enjoy. We've recently updated the benefits for all three of our membership levels, so make sure to check out the link down in the show notes below to learn more and join us as an official Patreon member of Friends and Fellow Citizens. Now, I would like to introduce our special guest this week. Marine Colonel James D. Bullet McGinley retired from the Marine Corps after more than 32 years of service. In his final assignment, he served as the Deputy Commander, Expeditionary Strike Group 5, leading a rapidly deployable battle staff with command authority for over 20 U.S. warships, 39 aircraft, and 4,500 sailors, Marines, and Guardians. This was his third and final combat tour after returning from a one-year combat assignment in Iraq, where he served as the Deputy Commander, Chief of Staff for the Iraq Assistance Group, a joint command within Multinational Corps Iraq in Baghdad. As a naval aviator in 2001, then Lieutenant Colonel McGinley took command of HMH 769, the Titans, flying stateside pre-deployment missions for the 1st Marine Division, and providing high-altitude operations training for 42nd Commando, British Royal Marines in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. In 2004, Colonel McGinley was selected to serve on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. Upon completion of his Joint Staff tour, he immediately deployed with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force to pre-surge Ramadi, Al-Anbar Province, Iraq in fall of 2006. During this combat tour, he served as the Transition Training Team Leader and was assigned the mission of establishing the first Provincial Joint Coordination Center for the province. He also served as the inaugurating director of the Al-Anbar PJCC. In May 2008, Colonel McGinley returned to Iraq for a one-year combat tour as the Deputy Commander, Chief of Staff of the Iraq Assistance Group, working on operations and plans directly affecting coalition force efforts to train, mentor, and advise Iraqi security forces. Colonel McGinley's combat decorations include the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the Iraq Campaign Medal. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very honored to be welcoming our guest this week, Colonel James McGinley. Colonel, thank you so much for being on Friends and Fellow Citizens this week.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, you have a remarkable background in the Marine Corps and really in the life of public service. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to reach out to you. And today we're going to be covering on a number of issues, but I want to first start a little bit with more about your military experience and background, because it is truly remarkable to read about a profile like yours. And also because it's so important to reflect on the military service of our military members. Would you mind elaborating a bit more about your career, how you got into the Marine Corps, and some of the early experiences that you had firsthand as you became part of the Marine Corps?
Well, I spent, before I retired from the Marine Corps, I spent 30 years as a naval aviator, military pilot. And within those 30 years, the final years, because of all of the post 9/11 conflict, I did 3 combat tours in the Middle East, one of which was out in Iraq, in the Ramadi and Fallujah area in Al-Anbar, prior to the surge. and then back for a second 13-month tour based out of Baghdad, and then a final 13-month tour based out of Manama, Bahrain, as the deputy commander with the Expeditionary Strike Group. So with that, it became a very broad experience flying aboard the carrier out in the Pacific, particularly down in the areas of places like Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, and then contrast that with living in a rather austere environment out in Ramadi in 2006, 2007, at a point where in pre-surge Ramadi things were unfortunately very bloody. There came a point after the kind of primary kinetic phase, the part that most people think of as combat and war, where we were transitioning as a nation to try and stand up a new functioning Iraqi government. And part of that requires security forces. And the Iraqis had highway patrol, they had Iraqi police, the Iraqi army. So various different elements of security forces and what we would think of as border patrol for trying to secure their landmass borders. All of that fell under essentially under the command and control of the Iraq Assistance Group, not for the actual authority to move those forces, but to teach, to train, to mentor, and advise. So we had transition teams that embedded with these newly stood up security forces, and they would spend part of each day teaching and training. And as that teaching and training progressed, it moved on to mentoring and then finally to advising the newly formed units on how to be most effective in their various different roles. So for the Iraq Assistance Group, we had the overarching command on behalf of the multinational Corps Iraq, which then actually nested under Multinational Force Iraq for these various different transition teams spread across the entire nation. When I was there in 2006, 2007, I stood up the Provincial Joint Coordination Center, or PJCC, and that had some of the same sorts of teaching and training types of objectives. And so for me, the next step in that progression, after actually having been on the ground and nested in as part of a teach, train, mentor, and advise mission, it then essentially blossomed into the deputy commander and chief of staff for the Iraq Assistance Group, where we took on the larger role of trying to coordinate all of those transition teams across the nation of Iraq and across multiple lines of effort, particularly when you think about how different it is for essentially a border patrol or a border checkpoint type function compared to Iraqi police or Iraqi army.
Well, I really appreciate your introduction, Colonel, and thank you so much for sharing about this. One of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking was about the cultural barriers that you and your team had to face as reality. How did you and your team deal with those cultural barriers when you were all in Iraq at the time?
I think a lot of it had to do with expectations. I would have young Marines who would expect that after they had done a training presentation, that they would essentially mint another Marine. And the answer was that the Iraqis have their own unique culture and a proud culture of thousands of years of history. And I always thought that Iraq had unbelievable potential because of the various different nations across that region. They had water with, rivers like the Tigris or the Euphrates, the great river from the Old Testament, the Euphrates. Also, they had strong traditions of education, universities. And then, of course, they had this massive oil wealth. And when you put those three things together, I thought that they had enormous potential. But part of it was letting Iraqis be Iraqis and have the understanding that culturally they were going to be so entirely different and unique that it would not be an easy frame of reference. I think the second thing for some of our younger troops was the idea that we hadn't moved the ball all the way to absolute completion. And what I tried to help them understand is if you can move this mission forward in any significant way, then that is a successful time in Iraq. And putting those two things together, I thought was very helpful. One of the things that I did was colonels normally did not speak to junior Iraqis. It didn't matter whether they were Iraqi police or Iraqi army or Iraqi border patrol, any of those different types of units. But I thought it would be helpful to actually have me sit down and talk with them. And I had one young Iraqi soldier look at me and say, in essence, are you a person of faith? And being out in the combat zone, I had a rosary right in my flight suit sleeve pocket, and I pulled it out to show him about my faith. And is the moment I pulled out rosary beads around the table, I saw Muslim prayer beads come out of pockets and start to dangle. And you could see many of those Iraqis had never met or talked to somebody who was not Muslim. And so to find this out was an instant point of kind of coming together, a little bit of bonding. And there were a lot of actually questions about my own faith and how that had influenced me, because I think that they were really trying to learn about what American culture is and really what and who Americans are. The net effect was, I thought, very productive and wound up with a group that over time came together very well. Another thing that I thought inadvertently was helpful was we were able to scrounge a discarded ping pong table, and we wound up having Americans versus Iraqis playing ping pong. And then we switched it up and had combined teams with Iraqi and American on each side. And that type of just sport, without it being a contact sport, worked very well to bring them together and start to get to know each other. The final thing was I had asked all of the U.S. Marines that were in my command as part of the transition team for the Provincial Joint Coordination Center to learn a handful of phrases in Arabic so that they could, in essence, extend a hand of friendship as they started to team together. That proved to be the single most important thing that we did in many ways to kind of remove barriers and break that down. It did a couple of different things. One, it showed that the Americans were not coming in essentially with a snobbish approach that they were too good to attempt Arabic, but it also showed them as being a little bit vulnerable because their accents may not be right. They may not be pronouncing things correctly. And the Iraqis had a chance, as we tried to train them on very specific technical skills, to return the favor and teach us a bit about both their language and a little bit about their culture as well. So with that, I think that just that one piece wound up being a very important part of the relationship aspect of bringing a team together, forming a team, and then bonding a team so that they could be much more productive as they went through this cycle of teaching, training, mentoring, and then finally advising before turning it over, which was the end state, was to turn the Iraqi governance piece back over to Iraqi government control and transition from American control.
Those are such great stories, Colonel. I was thinking a little bit about ping pong diplomacy back in the 70s. Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
But taking out another level, I really love how you described that diplomatic approach. Even though you were part of the military, that I think is is super unique and maybe something that maybe not a lot of people really know about, because we often think about the combat side of things, and those are integral obviously with the mission of the military, but to add on those bits of bridges, so to speak, bridges and connecting with the Iraqis. That's so great. If I may ask, how well did you do on your ping pong? Were you able to sharpen your skills?
My ping pong was always ordinary, but I did enjoy learning some of the Iraqi language, and I think that was helpful. We obviously relied on some of the translators that we had to take, and particularly when we were dealing with senior leaders like the governor of Al Anbar. Al Anbar, just for reference, is about that particular province is about a third of the entire landmass of Iraq. And when one of the things that I found to be very effective, and I actually offered along as coaching to other senior U.S. officers for various different generals, was that people oftentimes put the senior leader from Iraq that they were talking to at one side of the table, then put the translator or the linguist right in the middle, and then sat at the other end. And what I found was everybody started talking to the translator. And so it wound up being a three-way conversation like this. What I always did was seat the translator to my offside and look directly at the person I'm talking to and let the translated voice flow from behind me so that I could maintain eye contact and be in the conversation with the person I'm talking to. And it's a small thing, but it's amazing how it changes the character and the quality of the communication. Oftentimes, I would see their expressions change and respond to their expression. And I found out later that there were a couple of Iraqis that thought I knew more how to speak more Arabic than I was letting on because of my responses were preceding the translation. And in fact, my Arabic hadn't progressed that far, but it meant that I was that much further into the communication than I would have been if I had been bouncing back and forth off the translator instead of actually communicating with the person who I was talking to. So there were things like that that actually really lend themselves to the experience, and things that I think would be useful going forward in other countries or other circumstances. All of those lessons learned, I think, are enormously helpful. And it also helps us understand that this notion that the country goes to war, the kinetic part of it, it really ought to be conceptualized only as a small part. You know, if you think about the Japanese, the Germans, and to some extent the Italians out of World War II, though World War II ended in the 40s, in the mid 40s, we still have bases and we still have interactions with the Japanese, and we still have that same sort of arrangement with our bases in Germany. And you can see how we've grown our economies together, our cultures together. And of course, in no small part, we also helped draft the constitutions and form some of the culture that came out of World War II. And same thing with Korea. We're still in Korea, 50 years later, thereabouts. And it shows you that if you looked at World War II, the kinetic piece only lasted for a couple of years. Tough years, particularly tough on the Marine Corps. But if you think about that relationship and how long and how hard we've worked on our relationship with the country of Japan and Germany, that starts to give you an understanding of how you might conceptualize it well beyond just the basic kinetic phase in which bombs are dropping and bullets are flying.
Colonel, that is also a very clever part of just understanding people, understanding how people respond to each other. And I think by recognizing that while we come from different cultures, the Iraqis and the Americans, and yet there are kind of these common languages, not language as in like Farsi or English, but language as in body language or the way that we interact. So I just I really want to commend you for thinking of those in advance and to execute them. And I guess this is a good transition now into a bit about your experience with the Navy League. And as we spoke a bit earlier before our recording, we had John Kaskin and Rear Admiral Sinclair Harris just several weeks ago, last year in 2021. And they offered two amazing episodes discussing our naval strategy in regards to China, some of the issues that are happening really domestically, everything from shipbuilding to supply chain issues to COVID. There's a whole range of things to cover. Colonel, let's start with your involvement in the Navy League. How did you get involved, and what is your role as part of the United States Marine Corps Affairs Committee?
Well, the Navy League embraces beyond just the United States Navy and really looks to the maritime component. So you see Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and obviously Merchant Marine has an aspect in all of that as well. If you look at the Navy Marine Corps team, that's actually how I met Admiral Harris. He and I were assigned into Expeditionary Strike Group 5 to stand it up at the point we were assigned. There was no Strike Group 5. We brought that from scratch as the fleet commander wanted to have a dedicated strike group assigned to Fifth Fleet. But with that, it then blossomed in both to a very full tour of it had combat phase, but also it had some other non-combat and also anti-piracy operations all out in Fifth Fleet. Bring that forward into the Navy League, and they were looking for a bit of the Marine perspective in the Navy Marine Corps team for future strategies and future operations and what our strategic outlook might be. And with that, I have been writing that strategy piece on behalf of the Navy League and the reaching out to the active component of the Marine Corps for some of their initiatives and to see where the Navy League might have common interests and may be supportive.
What do you think are some of the big challenges that the Marine Corps is facing when it comes to our strategy, our naval strategy in the Indo-Pacific at this time?
I think probably the single biggest issue for the Marine Corps is the capacity of the Communist Chinese to find, fix, locate, and then target with precision fires. And I think what that means, kind of broken down into kind of more plain language, is that large Navy service vessels, that sounds like aircraft carriers and larger surface warfare strike groups and things, if they are readily targeted, then we can't put them into a stand-in fight. And if they can't come to a stand-in fight, then they have to stay outside of an engagement zone. And that means that the tactics have to change dramatically. And it also changes amphibious approaches and what types of strategies and tactics are employed. For that, my own nickname for that is Marines and Submarines. If you have an area where the enemy has enough capacity to create that kind of denial of your major assets, then the question becomes, how do you take and modify tactics, techniques, strategies, procedures in order to cope with it? And one of the ways to do that is to use submarines, to have them put as much of the Chinese Navy and the Chinese threat out of commission immediately at the top of any conflict, but also to use Marines that may be in places that are not well monitored or predicted, and use them actually as anti-ship threats as well. So if you can have Marines that are shore-based on an island, killing Chinese ships effectively at sea, you can see that before long we can open up an area where where America's fleet can operate safely and effectively. But moving through that initial phase becomes critical, particularly when you have that volume of threat and most specifically for precision targeting against the U.S. and U.S. shipping as a target. So I think that that's a lot of what the Marine Corps is trying to adjust to. And one of the key approaches that's being discussed publicly is distributed operations, where you would take and have small to extremely small units of Marines spread across a vast area of the Pacific and use their capacity to disrupt, to reshape what it would look like in the maritime domain in the early time frame of a kinetic fight. Certainly, we don't want a kinetic fight. That's not good for either nation, and it's not good for the sons and daughters of either nation. But if it comes to that, being very effective and very quick about it could be the difference between having a quick and successful engagement, which then raises the cost too high for an enemy to continue. I should do two things here. One is the Chinese people, the actual people that are there, are very hardworking and are victimized by this communist regime much more than even the rest of the world is. They bear the most direct brunt of the damage done by that communist regime. And so we should talk about the communist regime, its governance, and its party separate and apart from the Lao Baijing, the actual normal, everyday, hardworking guy who's just trying to look after his family. That's not where the future of China is. And that's the problem with having the People's Republic of China as a communist regime controlling and doing enormously destructive things in the first instance to the Chinese people, and of course threatening to the rest of peace-loving countries on the globe. The second thing is we've learned from the prior administration that the single most effective weapon that this country has against that communist regime isn't military at all. It's tariffs. And the tariffs are dramatically more threatening and are a much greater concern. The two great concerns for PRC are tariffs and religion. And those are strengths for us, but it also allows us opportunities. And so much could be accomplished with much more with tariffs in terms of recalibrating the trading relationship. And the other thing is onshoring. Every time we bring a manufacturing onshore, then instead of taking and shipping by way of maritime operations raw materials all the way to China, where just tragically it's oftentimes slave labor and child labor that actually does the physical manufacturing, and then those manufactured goods by way of containerized intermodal units are shipped back to the United States, again, using an awful lot of fossil fuel to get it there in the first place and then bring it back. If we physically manufactured it in New Jersey, drove it across the bridge and consumed it, the newest microwave, the newest camera, the newest computer just arrived in to New York City, you can see how much more effective, efficient, what a better use of our energy resources. And it would ease a lot of the pressure that goes on right now in the maritime domain. And it would also then take and have the Chinese people have a different relationship with the government that they have right now. And those would be much more effective strategies for us than trying to build more aircraft carriers. So it can be as simple as making sure that we used tariffs effectively and persistently to recalibrate the relationship, the trading relationship that we have with communist China. And in the meantime, benefit the American people, benefit their jobs, and of course, benefit their climate by reducing a fossil fuel footprint, which I think would be fantastic for everyone.
Well, that's such great information that you provided, Colonel. Because what I like about your answer is that it really goes back to those fundamentals, at least in my opinion, the fundamentals of having that whole government approach, and about not just focusing on one factor, not just focusing on, as you said, building more aircraft carriers. That is, I love to see another big aircraft carrier, the biggest one. It's got to be bigger and bigger every single time there's a new one. I think I watched videos about how they work and everything. It's so fascinating. It's like a little city essentially. But as you were pointing out, there's all these other factors too, about the fossil fuels, about the economic side of things. What are still some of those challenges of being able to pivot the Marine Corps from land-based combat or that sort of era of national security policy to the contemporary challenges that we're facing right now in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, if you look at how the theater is different, how the type of warfare that would be conducted is different, the challenges are, without overstating it, very significant. One of the techniques that the U.S. might employ by way of the Marine Corps is the distributed operations. And if we do that, we're going to need long-range precision fires. So you see the Marine Corps now talking much more about either long-range artillery or missiles, and also looking at anti-ship missiles. The question becomes, how do you deploy them into these very broad-reaching areas, and then how do you resupply them, and how do you communicate with them? Particularly if you can't use traditional Navy resupply, and especially if you have an enemy that's sophisticated enough to take down key elements of your communication architecture. And some of the different thinking, though, the Marine Corps Commandant put out a document called Force Design 2030. They're doing a lot of experimenting. They've updated in 2021. I think we'll see another update coming out here in the spring, would be my rough guess. And with that, as they experiment, they're trying different approaches to see what works and developing some of those tactics. But I think in one of the more extreme circumstances, you might imagine where you wouldn't have the ability to resupply the Marines at all, and you wouldn't have the ability to communicate with them. So maybe that becomes broad mission orders, which says that in this area, do those things that will aid in our overarching goal, and turn them loose. Maybe they live on the economy. Maybe they come into the theater by way of civilian aircraft wearing civilian clothes. Maybe they are resupplied by the economy. Maybe you have to adjust what their purchasing footprint looks like because you can trace credit cards. So all of those different things when you start to add in a cyber layer, but it means that the Marines will be much more interested in low Earth orbit communications capacities. It may mean that we're looking more at some of the basics of old shortwave and longwave radio. There may be a lot of different permutations or workarounds in that concept. The other thing that we have advocated is the idea of having a very low cost semi-submersible that would look an awful lot like a narco sub and would take and sail in the middle of the night. A beach itself, Marines would dash down to the beach, grab the supplies off, turn it around, push it back out to sea. And if we lost that vessel, it would be so very inexpensive, it would be expendable enough that if it could even complete a couple of missions, it would be worth the expense. And so part of what the Commandant has defined is stand-in forces, which means forces that are durable enough, resilient enough, and in some cases, equipment that is expendable enough that it can stay right in the middle of the fight and can't be driven out by a determined enemy because it's either a hard target or it's something that if occasionally they get lucky and nail one of our semi-submersibles, we've lost only a very small expense versus the good it was able to do in several resupply missions. So that's a rethink for a military that always wanted the fastest, the most expensive, the most sophisticated, the most complex, taking and turning that on its head and saying, what is the cheapest, most rugged, most resilient, but small enough that if you now, instead of having a handful of major targets, if the PRC now has, say, 10 or 15,000 individual targets, and they all move frequently, and they're not cooperative about showing themselves either electronically or visually, it makes that eventual solution for an enemy dramatically more difficult. And then at that point, we don't need to be perfect. We just need to be persistent. And slowly but surely, you would see targets coming off the target list for the targeteers as they nominate them, as we smack them down. Each one then makes that domain much safer to the point where the Navy can operate with a surface fleet. And that's the point that we would move beyond my initial piece that I call Marines and submarines, and then bring in the rest of American sea power. All of that ties back into that initial kinetic phase. And then with the idea that we also have to know, based on our experiences in Iraq, that we need a follow-on plan on how we will mature that relationship in a way that's much more productive over a long period of time. And there I'm talking typically somewhere between 70 and 100 years. You need multiple generations to take and recalibrate some of the cultural issues and have some of the success that we've had from enemies that we faced in World War II.
Yes, I think it's important to have that historical context and put the national security landscape into context as well. Colonel, I'm also interested in the cyber realm of things. What can you tell us about what the Marine Corps is doing, working with other branches of the military and the U.S. government to expand those cyber capabilities during this time when we're confronting China on all kinds of fronts?
Well, for an ideal requirement for the Marine Corps would be a highly resilient command, control, and communications network. The question is, can technology deliver on it? And if technology can deliver on it, can an enemy still then, with some persistence, find a way to defeat it? This is part of what the Russians were trying to demonstrate in knocking out a satellite over the past few weeks. Which is to say that I can take your satellites down. So if you're depending on satellites, and that could be depending on for communication, it could also be for guidance by way of GPS. So if those come off the map, if that is instantly degraded, then the question becomes, how do you continue to function without it? So ideally, if we can have resilient command, control, and communications, that architecture is enormously valuable because it allows us to synchronize. And when you're working in a very highly distributed operations, trying to synchronize becomes exponentially more difficult. The flip side from that is to say you also need to be able to plan for an environment where all of that is lost, and yet you still function without command, without control, and without communications. And that may look like very broad mission orders and highly creative teams of young Marines out doing wonderful things on behalf of their country, but literally working through the problem without being able to get additional guidance or direction anytime soon, and operating both either semi-autonomously or fully autonomously based on where they are and what their area of responsibility is. So for the kind of the shorter version of that is, I think the Marine Corps is, in a way that I have never seen before, looking for its joint partners as force multipliers. So what can Space Force and Air Force do for us? What is the Navy's capacity for resupply in a highly contested environment that has the capacity for highly accurate targeting of ships with anti-ships missiles? So different things like that. Where can the joint force plus up the Marine Corps and add additional capability and capacity in a way that is symbiotic, while at the same time recognizing that we may have periods of time where we are still adjusting and adapting and regenerating. I do think that America's enemies they would underestimate us if they thought that we don't have the capacity for regeneration, particularly in space. I think that people would be awed at what we can do if we need to. And I think that would be an opportunity for the United States, because I think enemies will underestimate that. And when they do so at their own peril. And at that point, then it's time for the U.S. To boldly exercise all of its capacity and do it in a synchronized fashion in order to try and develop that kind of shock of overwhelming an enemy and psychologically capitalizing on that moment of vulnerability.
It's pretty remarkable how important it is to think about that ability to adapt when it's already pretty challenging to have to deal with the signal strength of our Wi-Fi's. It seems like there are just these moments when maybe because of the Wi-Fi is down or something, then I guess I know, at least in my circle here, it's almost like panic mode. But then it's like, well, what happens if that was at a much larger scale? And so just to explore that a bit more is truly wonderful. So, but I also want to now focus a bit more on our strategic partners, based on your experiences as serving as the deputy commander of the Iraq Assistance Group and the Anbar Provincial Joint Coordination Center. What sort of ways can we bond more closely with our allies, our Indo-Pacific allies like Taiwan and the Philippines and Japan, Korea, and others, to gain a much more offensive approach and more effective approach on this national security competition that we have with China?
Well, I think your question is wonderful for its depth and sophistication, because it really does point out that given the enormous size of that area of responsibility, when you look across the expanse of the Pacific, you do need to have various different areas for basing, for resupply, for refueling. I think what is helpful to us is that the People's Republic of China has brutalized the other countries in the area. And so they have essentially pushed a lot of those countries over towards the United States. I think when we see our interests align, I think we find strengths. I think also when we start to divest ourselves of manufacturing and larger business relationships with PRC and reinvest them into places like Taiwan or Thailand or the Philippines, any of those other countries throughout the region, as those economic ties build with those countries, and as we divest in our economic ties or balance them much more carefully than what we have in the past with the PRC, I think that at that point you start to see us coming together quite well. The all elbows bully approach, the communist Chinese are finding that they can buy friends, but they'll have them only so long as the money flows, and the relationship only goes as deep as the cash. So with that, I think that it creates opportunities for us with better statesmanship and better statecraft, because that is a weakness for them. They're not as good strategically. as you would think that they should be, in spite of Sun Tzu. And they're not as good at the nuance of relationships as a nation that size should be. That makes opportunities for us where we can do that better. The caution for any country that might more fully align with the United States is the Chinese are ruthless in their determination to exact retribution. So they will do that. And of course, the Australians are finding out some of that right now. And Taiwan is getting a lot of bellicose gesturing. I don't see that there is any chance that the Chinese won't move on Taiwan. And I think that they feel that their time to do that is now and in the moment, especially after how we came out of Afghanistan. I think that emboldened them and left them very confident that we do not have a defense structure that would challenge them, that the leadership here in the United States at this point will now open that vacuum up and allow the Chinese to do some things that they have wanted to do for decades. So that makes it extremely dangerous. And there could come a point where they miscalculate, or that the United States is provoked to overreact, which I think would be horrific. So we, literally in the weeks and months ahead, we're not talking about years ahead, their time is now. And that makes this point in history extremely dangerous, and one where the United States needs to have a very well thought out, pre-calibrated response. But I think, unfortunately, right now, the way we're positioned with U.S. leadership, I don't think that we have the strength to respond in a way that not only is effective, but also has the sufficient calibration to maintain the autonomy of Taiwan, while at the same time balancing that relationship with PRC. So PRC clearly, I think, senses at this point in time it has, by a long shot, the upper hand in this relationship. And it's just coming back from really being on its heels prior to COVID. And there's no doubt that COVID was a part of the Chinese response to the U.S. relationship. And now the world is making its way through it.
Big questions ahead of us, absolutely, when it comes to Taiwan and some of those issues that relate to COVID and other trade, etc. I'm obviously, this is an area with regards to Taiwan. This is a huge question, huge problem that we really have to think very carefully about, and also really consider the consequences of inaction. I hope that Taiwan is not our Suez, and I hope that there is some kind of consideration for a scenario that no one here wants. But Colonel, I want to now, before we get to our reflection phase of our episode, I was browsing a bit before our recording today, looking at one of the newer white papers, or really strategy documents, that has been put out by the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard, which is called Advantage at Sea. And I guess I'll just use that title as to frame my question, which is, based on the topics that we've covered today, and your research and your work with the Navy League, and your experience serving in the Marines for more than 30 years, what do you think are some of the key pillars that we need to really focus on as we build our strategy into the rest of the 2020s, 2030s, maybe all the way to the middle of the 21st century and beyond?
I think probably the single most important thing we could do is really identify our national strategic interests. We probably have spent too many years stretched too thin without an understanding of how we can best influence. And I think within the military, it's very hard to have senior leadership understand just how narrow the goals are that can be accomplished with kinetics. So if you sit down with an entire National Security Council, you have all the civilian side of our national leadership from the president on down. The part that the military can achieve by blowing things up or killing things is pretty modest. It's a small slice. So if you think of 180 degrees being the total solution, maybe you can get 20 or 30 degrees out of the entire 180 using kinetics. Everything else has to be something other than kinetics. And normally, I think from kind of an American way of war, we imagine that we can bring the full 180 degrees solution, top to bottom, front to back, left to right. It is an entirely military solution. And normally we find out that that's just a small portion of what it will take to actually achieve those goals. The second thing is, I think that we haven't given enough consideration to an idea that we change our strategy drastically and say what we're really looking for is freedom of maneuver and freedom of action. So that the classic Westphalian nation state has its borders and we respect those borders. But if there's a threat within those borders and that particular government refuses to address that threat sufficiently so that the United States can guarantee its own national security, under those circumstances, then those borders no longer mean anything to us. They're no longer in charge of that country and we're no longer constrained. That means relooking international law. It means probably to some extent relooking some of the other types of treaty obligations. But it says basically this: if you have a threat and you won't address it, we will. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are invading, but it might mean that we are wide open for a drone strike that serves our purpose. So we will move where we would like to move, and we will engage when and where we'd like to engage. It probably doesn't look like major troop movements, and it probably doesn't look like other larger kind of national muscle moves. But it does look like the United States going to where it needs to be and addressing threats in a calibrated way where it wants to address them. I think if you rethought that, it might mean that for something like Afghanistan, you don't have a large force, but you have a small force that goes and identifies various threat cells and at that point destroys them. And it might mean that we operate from international waters or that we operate from nearby friendly countries, but with a dramatically smaller, more sophisticated footprint. And I think that that would be much more effective for the American people, be much more cost effective. But again, it comes back to answering that initial question: what is your strategic interest? I think also if you go back to what you could literally nickname, produce locally and consume locally, right? Buy local. If we wind up being a bit more self-contained as we were through most of our nation's history, then our need to try and control other countries and control sea lanes immediately moderates. And so we can find a better foreign policy and a more realistic, affordable military footprint by being more self-contained, less reliant on either foreign manufacturing or foreign oil. And we've had a few glimpses recently into that approach. And we had some points where people could actually afford to fill up the tank on the SUV. We've gone in the opposite direction. And I think that that's very unfortunate because it does create strategic vulnerabilities for us, both from our economy, but also in terms of the pressure that it creates on leadership. So with that, I think that's how we might recalibrate it.
Very well said, Colonel. And you touched upon those aspects that affect the economy. I'm not even going to get started on the $7 per gallon gas in California, because that is a whole other episode and focus mainly just grievances about how expensive, ridiculously expensive it is, especially for the average American. Colonel, you've provided so much valuable information about the Marine Corps and about our strategy in China, or in the Indo-Pacific regards to China. and some of the other issues that we need to be aware of as we progress through in this decade and for decades to come. To tie this all back into Washington's 6 principles of his farewell address, which one or which ones do you think are most relevant to our topics that we've covered today?
Well, I think it would be hard to overstate the importance from a national perspective on patriotism and faith as bedrocks. But I think that there are other things that are going on now. The capacity for communication, even if you think about the communication that we right now are enjoying in this conversation, this would have been impossible several decades ago. It would have been enormously expensive, even within the past 20, 30 years. And the fact that we both can just log on with the internet shows an entirely different time. The Marine Corps has a new think piece out called Talent Management 2030. And they reach back to legacy notions of diversity. And I've seen this happen here of late. When I was growing up, we moved beyond a lot of race-based relationships, and we built communities of people that saw people. It's unfortunate that we've gone back. And you ask yourself, why are we so determined to go backwards? And I think the answer is because we're using a legacy notion of diversity. But think about the people who are coming up with these policies. They're in their 70s and 80s. They grew up in a time of the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. They're a half a century beyond where all the rest of us are. So I think as we see post-millennial and Generation Z, they don't carry that same baggage. The new diversity, the legacy diversity were things like race or gender or ethnicity. Those are legacy issues. This younger generation has already moved beyond that, but they have an expectation of communication. They're used to video teleconference. They're used to really superb communication, and they're used to sophisticated and nuanced communication. And the one last hurdle for that is a magnificent opportunity for the military, and it's one that we've touched on, and that's language. Language is the new diversity. If we can get to the point where we can communicate effectively, then it's amazing how much more productive, efficient, and effective we can be. And if I was going to take and look at that talent management think piece that was produced by the Marine Corps, I would wipe a fair amount of it to the side. There's some other career management pieces which I think are helpful, but I would say above all, we need to be bringing people into the Marine Corps with their key talent being language. So if you said the way to get in the Naval Academy to be hyper competitive is to, at the time of competing for entrance, to bring 4 years of formal language training as part of your application as a new student. And then during your time at the academy, a required 4 additional years. If you start graduating young officers with at least 8 years of formal language training, and it would be nice if it's a strategic language, it would be enormously helpful, particularly for distributed operations. The second piece of that would be if we're going to take and put widely distributed units of Marines across a large or vast area, wouldn't it be nice if they were out with indigenous populations, if they actually sourced from indigenous population backgrounds? So if we need to have people in Taiwan, do we have a Taiwanese Marine who has full language skills and yet maybe was raised in LA, down in Gardena or San Diego or someplace like that? So I think that there's a real opportunity for us in our recruiting, a real opportunity for us in our retention to emphasize language skills as being just as critical as any other skill that we bring to the battlefield, specifically so that as we manage the kinetic piece, we can also manage a post-kinetic piece and understand the opportunities when we are operating in very small units, widely dispersed, alone and unafraid, but needing to communicate with people and maybe in some cases not only communicate but blend. And I think that that's our new diversity. And I'd love to see the Marine Corps lead the way in that and say the legacy diversity, let's be very proud of the accomplishments that we have experienced in the Marine Corps, because my time in the Marine Corps was very impressive on that issue. And now take up a new challenge, which is language diversity, and master that next piece and do it through the teaching, the training, and the mentoring and advising of our American students before we take and bring them into the Marine Corps, either through Officer Candidate School or through the recruit depot, and then deepen that understanding and that proficiency during their time of deployment within the Marine Corps. I think if we could do that, we would find a great deal of opportunity at just a fraction of the cost, and the payoff to the American people would be superb. And then at the end of whatever time they have in the Marine Corps, whether it's a 20-year retirement or whether it's a 5-year hitch, they could take those same skills to IBM, GM, or 3M and market their capacity to do international business. And that would, I think, be the new and next step for us as the American people as we bring the rest of the globe more closely together.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to my parents who have given me these opportunities to learn these amazing languages, because there really is such value in them, and you don't necessarily reap the benefits until much later. But I could not be more grateful to them, and really to all those who take on the foreign language opportunities to really put yourself out there and to climb a new challenge. Colonel, I am so grateful for your time today, because you have given us not only an amazing perspective on the role of the Marine Corps when it comes to our naval strategy in the Indo-Pacific, but you've also, I think, really well integrated the Marine Corps into the much larger whole of government approach, and the ability for America to not only be good at just building more military equipment. I really appreciate how you've really brought this approach across to multiple sectors in the United States. And I think this is what's, I think, is very, very fitting with the national unity side of things as part of the pillar. So, Colonel, I admire so much, obviously, not just what the Navy League does, but what you do every single day, and your involvement as part of the Marine Corps Committee at the Navy League. And I really hope that we'll continue this conversation, and I hope that this conversation can be expanded to as many audiences as possible.
Sherman, thanks so much. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. And thank you all to the audience for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America always gets better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.